C.T. Studd, Cricketer and Pioneer, by Norman P. Grubb. Chapter 1. A Visit to a Theatre and Its Consequences. The Punchestown races were over. Crowds were returning homeward from the famous Irish Derby by train and by cross-channel boat. Among them was a wealthy retired planter. He hurried to Kingstown harbour, but arrived 5 minutes too late to catch the boat. There was nothing else for him to do but to stay the night in Dublin. He was at a loose end, and not knowing how to spend the evening, took a stroll. He noticed over a theatre the names D. L. Moody and Ira D. Sankey, wondered what vaudeville company this was, and went in to have the surprise of his life. He was amazed to find the place crowded out, and on the platform a number of people in ordinary dress and a man singing. He had a wonderful voice and was singing words such as he had never heard before. As the refrain came again and again with each verse of the hymn, there were 99 that safely lay in the shelter of the fold, but one was out on the hills away, far off from the gates of gold. He stood absolutely riveted. The hymn over, he sat down and heard Moody preach, and strange to relate, instead of going back home next day, he stayed on day after day. Finally, one evening, he followed a great throng of people who rose to go into the inquiry room. Moody knelt beside him and simply said, "Mr. Vincent, do you believe Jesus Christ died for you?" "I do," he replied. "Then," said Moody, "thank him." He did, and he left that room a transformed man. Mr. Vincent had a great friend, Mr. Edward Studd, also a retired planter. He had made a fortune in India and had come back to England to spend it. He was very fond of sport of all kinds. He went into regular training to go fox hunting and was master of the hounds. His sons were almost born in the saddle. They were hunting at 5 and 6 years of age, strapped to the saddle, and each in his little red coat, and that in Leicestershire, supposed to have the stiffest fences of any county in England. Leaving Hallerton Hall, he bought a large place in Wiltshire, Tedworth, now Tidworth, well known to all soldiers. Here he turned a paddock into a first-rate cricket ground. These were the days when country house cricket was at its height, and throughout the summer matches and cricket weeks were arranged. But above all, he was an enthusiast on horse racing. To begin with, he was passionately fond of horses, and when he saw fine horses he would buy and train and then race them. He made a race course at Tedworth and kept a stud of about 20 horses. He won several steeplechases, but achieved his great ambition when he won the Grand National with a horse called Salamander. It was an unexpected victory, and congratulations and begging letters were showered on him, the family celebrating the occasion with a special dinner in town. After the Dublin mission had finished, Moody and Sankey came to London. Nobody believed very much at that time in a man getting up to preach the gospel unless he had two things, the title of Reverend and a white tie round his neck. The papers could not understand such a preacher as Mr. Moody, who had neither, and of course they printed column after column against him. But they could not help seeing that he could get more people to his meeting than half a dozen archbishops, and that more were converted than by 20 ordinary ministers. Of course, they did not put the right construction on things. They said that Mr. Sankey had come over to sell organs and Mr. Moody to sell his hymn books. Mr. Studd read the papers day after day, and these things tickled him immensely. One evening he threw the paper down and said, "Well, anyhow, when this man comes to London, I'm going to hear him. There must be some good about the man, or he would never be abused so much by the papers." At this same period, Mr. Studd had bought a horse that was better than any he had ever owned, and entered him for one of the big races. So certain was he of winning that he wrote to his friend Mr. Vincent and said, "If you're a wise man, you will come to the race and put every penny you can on my horse." A few days later he went up to town and met his friend. As they drove along in the carriage, Mr. Studd talked of nothing but this horse. They went to Tattersall's. After he had finished his business, he came back to Mr. Vincent and said, "How much money have you put on my horse?" "Nothing." "You're the biggest fool I ever saw," said Mr. Studd. "Didn't I tell you what a good horse he is? But though you're a fool, come along and dine with me. My family are all in the country, and you shall say where we shall go after dinner." Dinner over, Mr. Studd asked, "Now, where shall we go to amuse ourselves?" Mr. Vincent suggested Drury Lane Theatre. "What?" said Mr. Studd. "Isn't that where those fellows Moody and Sankey are?" "Oh no, this isn't Sunday. We will go to the theatre or a concert." "No," said Mr. Vincent. "You're a man of your word, and you said you would go where I chose." With very bad grace he went. On reaching the theatre, it was crowded out, and there were no seats left except special ones. But Mr. Vincent was determined to hold on to his prey, so, taking out a card case, he wrote hastily on a card to an usher whom he knew, "Come to a certain door and get us in. I have a wealthy sporting gentleman with me, but I will never get him here again if we don't get a seat." The man came, got them in by the green room door, across the stage, and plumped them down just under Moody's nose. Mr. Studd never took his eyes off Moody until he had finished his address. Afterwards he said, "I will come and hear this man again. He has just told me everything I have ever done." He kept his word and went again, until he was right soundly converted. In the afternoon of that day, wrote one of his sons later, father had been full of a thing that takes more possession of a man's heart and head than anything else, the passion of horse racing. And in the evening he was a changed man. Of course he could not go on living the same life as before. He could not go to balls, card parties, and all that sort of thing. His conscience told him so. So he decided to go and have it out with Mr. Moody. He went to him and said, "I want to be straight with you. Now I'm a Christian, shall I have to give up racing and shooting and hunting and theatres and balls?" "Well," said Mr. Moody, "Mr. Studd, you have been straight with me. I will be straight with you. Racing means betting, and betting means gambling, and I don't see how a gambler is going to be a Christian. Do the other things as long as you like." Father asked him again about the theatre and cards, and Moody said, "Mr. Studd, you have children and people you love. You are now a saved man yourself, and you want to get them saved. God will give you some souls, and as soon as ever you have won a soul, you won't care about any of the other things." Sure enough, to the astonishment of his children and many others, he didn't care for any of these things any longer, but only cared about one thing, and that was saving souls. He withdrew from the turf. giving a horse race to each of his elder sons as a hunter, and then sold the remainder. He cleared out the large hall of his house at Tedworth, furnished it with chairs and benches, and used to get splendid fellows down from London, merchants and businessmen, to preach the gospel to the people. He used to ride round the country and invite and urge the people to come, and come they did, in hundreds. The coachman put what had happened in a nutshell. A guest remarked to him that he had heard that Mr. Studd had become religious or something. "Well, sir," said he, "we don't know much about that, but all I can say is that though there's the same skin, there's a new man inside." Mrs. Studd only lived 2 years after this. His death came about in a remarkable manner. He was on his way to one of Moody's meetings and stopped the carriage suddenly, as he had forgotten to bring one of his grooms to the meeting. He alighted and told the rest to drive on. It was late, so he ran all the way back and broke a blood vessel in his leg. He never recovered from this, but as the clergyman said, who preached the sermon at his funeral, he did more in 2 years than most Christians do in 20. He wrote to his friends when he couldn't speak to them, and sometimes received pretty terse replies. He spoke fearlessly to anyone and everyone. One man who kept a shop in Regent Street was a thorough-going agnostic. Mr. Studd was the only man who ever had the courage to speak to him about his soul, and his son said afterwards, "I never remember my father so angry in his life at being so faithfully dealt with."